All right, so the main libraries we're going to be using today is the React testing library, the user event library, which is kind of the companion library to that. Make sure to install those. So the documentation should tell you how to do that. And then we're also going to be using create React app just as an example. So we have a basic application here, and that comes already built with a test script, which is behind the scenes. It's using Jest. So ideally, you also know the basics of Jest. So those three main libraries are kind of the fundamentals that you need to have an understanding of to do test-driven development. I do have a different video that I made recently that kind of covers how to use all three of those. If you're just learning the fundamentals, so make sure to check that video out first if you don't already know how to use them. All right, so let's talk about what we're gonna build here. Imagine that you're working for a company and you get requirements to build a login screen, right? You probably have a product, you want users to be able to log in there. You want to know who this person is as they're using your application, right? So typically when you get requirements like that, it might have a design, it might have some specifications, and it might say something like there should be a screen. As a user, I want to be able to type in my username and password, and there should be a submit button, and clicking that will log me in, right? So if we were trying to implement those requirements will directly transfer to the tests that you're trying to write. So let's get started with that. So first of all, you see that I'm using a login form here, and we are passing in a submit function, right? So our idea just here is that ultimately we want to be able to somehow pass whatever it is that the user submits to somewhere. Maybe it's an API request, whatever. So we have a login form here that right now just says implement me, so there's nothing there. And we also have our test, which is blank. So like I said, with TDD, you actually write the test first before you write the implementation, which it sounds backwards, but there's a reason behind it, so that ultimately by the time you're done implementing your code, it's already well tested, and it also kind of helps guarantee that your implementation is testable to begin with, right? So it also encourages that you're potentially writing good code and also making sure that all of your requirements are captured, up front. So in create React app, there is an npm test script that we can run, which will, run just behind the scenes. Right now it's already failing because there's nothing in here. So let's start writing some tests. So we said that the form should have a username and a password field, and maybe also a submit button, right? So the basic test here is just we want to be able to assert that those things are on the screen. Now it's passing because there's nothing inside this function, there's nothing being asserted. So we actually want to bring in React testing library. So we know that you need render and screen. You almost always need both of these from testing library /React. So if you remember from my previous video, you always have to render your component first, and then you do your assertions. So for example, you should be able to do expect screen dot get by text username dot to be in the document. All right, so all this does right now is it says that I should be able to find something on the screen that has the text username in it. So one thing that we can improve upon here is we can instead use get by label text, because what we actually want to find later on is the input boxes themselves. So get by label text is basically saying, find me the input that has this label, right? So we're expecting ultimately a form that has a username and a password field. So we should be able to get the input boxes for both of those. So I'm going to duplicate this and add one for password. And then we also said that we want a submit button, so we can do screen.getByText submit. Same thing, to be in the document, right? And you can also pull these out into variables if you want, like this. All right, so let's get started with our implementation. Let's write the minimal code that we need to get this test to pass. So the first thing is you see that it's failing to find a label that has or more specifically, it's failing to find an input that has a label of username. So I'm just gonna make a basic div here, and I'm gonna add a label for username and an input to get started. And you'll notice that even though we already have the label and input here, it's still not able to find the input box properly. And that's because we need to add HTML4 and ID. So adding those two things kind of just makes it kind of connect together, saying that this label is a label for this input box, right? So these values, the HTML4 and the ID, need to be the same. So you'll notice that in the test below, it kind of moved on to the next criteria already. Now it's not able to find the password because it was able to find a username field. Now it's over here, it's failing on that line. So easy solution there, right, is we just copy this, change this to password, and then make sure to update these as well. So you see on the right, we have our username and password fields, and then you'll see that the last missing piece is the submit button. That's why the test is still failing. So we're just gonna have a basic button here that says submit. And now all of our tests pass. So now we got our input fields, our test is passing. Where do we go from here? This is the part where it's a good time to maybe refactor some things. Maybe clean up the code a little bit. For example, I really want this to be a form. And since we're doing submit here, this should be type submit. So you can do a little bit of, so that's not going to affect the test in any way, but it's getting you closer to the real implementation. And you can see that I wrote some basic CSS for this already, just so that it doesn't look bad for this video. So I'll put that over here. You can look through that. But the point with test-driven development is that it's not necessarily about testing the look and feel, right? Like I could have removed all of the CSS and just made it ugly, and my tests would still pass, right? It's not about the look and feel. It's about the structure of your HTML, the behaviors that your users will do. So we're not going to talk about CSS too much in this video. So what do we do next? So in real life, likely this is not the only thing you need, right? Something has to happen when I type in something here, username and password, and submit, right? In a real application, something needs to happen. Right now, nothing happens. So perhaps you might have a test for the rest of your requirements. So for example, it should allow the user to submit their credentials, right? And by credentials we mean the username and password. So just like the first test, we're gonna have a render and also these similar things that finds their elements or form elements. So we're gonna copy that down, and then what we're gonna do differently in this test is we're gonna try to kind of simulate the user actually using your form. So how do we do that? This is where that second library comes into play. So the user event from testing library user event. Okay, so if we take that, you can use that to do things like typing. You can have it type into the username field. You know, maybe their person's username is Mambo. Why not, right? Same thing, we're gonna do user event type on the password field, probably using something very secure. And then finally, as the user is done typing, they're gonna click submit. So user event dot click on the submit button. And notice that our tests for this is passing because we didn't write any assertion. So what do we want to kind of assert, right? We said that after submit, we want those values to go somewhere. You know, maybe it's gonna push it up to a server, and then that server is gonna actually do the authentication. Over here, we're just concerned about the UI side of things. We just want to make sure that we're capturing those values and we're pushing those values out to somewhere. And if you remember from the beginning, we kind of said that we want to be able to pass in a submit prop to login form, and then that's going to be whatever logic that we have. It needs to be something that is able to extract those values. So Jest has a very nice feature with mock functions. So if we do submit equals jest.fn, we can then pass that in here as a prop. And the nice thing with these Jest functions is that we can do things like assert that that function was called. So for example, expect submit to have been called. So I expect this is going to make my test pass because we haven't implemented anything to make that work. And then I'm going to kind of take this a step further and say that I not only want it to be called, but I want it to be called with an object that looks like this, right? Like I want to assert that the values that the user actually provided is what's being submitted. And again, our test is passing. So again, you kind of go in this loop of like write a test that fails, write the implementation, refactor if you need to, and then you kind of just go back and forth until your implementation is done. And at the same time, your tests are also complete. So where do we go from here? We have our form, we got our inputs, we got our buttons. We know that we need to pass in a submit prop here. And you might think, do I just do on submit? We know that that's not enough because you're gonna get back the full event object, which we don't want, right? We only want the values. So we probably want to write our own kind of handler here, our internal handler that takes in an event and somehow eventually calls submit with the proper values. So one of the things that's missing here is we need to be able to have some insight into what's the current value of these input fields, right? As a user is typing and then eventually they click submit, we need to be able to pass those values into this submit call that we have here to get our test to pass. One of the ways that we can pull that off is, you'll see I already have the use state imported here. So we're going to utilize that to effectively control the state of the input boxes. So maybe we have a values here that initially it's just going to be blank. It's going to have our username, it's just blank, and password also initially blank, right? And then we're also going to add our handlers for the input boxes. So I'm going to do a handle change here, kind of similar to the submit, but as a user is typing, I need to be able to track what those changes are. So we're going to do set values, and we're going to spread the current values, and then we're going to change whatever is being changed. So how do we do that? We know that each of these inputs has an ID property. So we're going to do event.target.id, event.target.value. So how this is going to work is, for example, as a user is typing into input, you want to track that change. So we're going to pass handle change here, and then we want the value to be values.username. All right, so now we're controlling the state of this input field. We're kind of saving it into this values property, and you'll see that on change, which is effectively as the user is typing, we're capturing what that new value is by updating the property in our values object with the value that's being typed in. So the ID here maps to the IDs that we've provided in our inputs down here. So similarly, we're going to copy that to our password field, except the value needs to be password. Okay, and then one last thing is that, all right, now we're tracking the values. We need to be able to submit those values. So this actually just becomes submit values. So it's going to submit whatever the current value of our form is. And then also want to make sure that we have prevent default here, and because we don't want our page refreshing. And then one last thing, the actual last thing, is that we don't want to pass the submit directly in here anymore. We actually want to pass our own internal handler, handle submit. And now we have 2 over tests passing. Right? And now if we actually test this out manually, right, I can do test something here, and when I submit, it's going to show me my alert, because in app here we're just alerting out the values. So that's it. That's the basics of test-driven development. Again, as a reminder, the idea is just write your test first, and then write just enough code to get your implementation to pass, to get your test to pass, and then you kind of just go in that loop, write more tests, get it to pass, write more tests, get it to pass, and then the end product is effectively you've written code that is A, already tested, and B, you're likely writing testable code, because your test will not pass if you're not writing testable code. So lots of benefits with test-driven development, from just making sure that you always have good coverage, it'll likely catch bugs up front, and then it also makes sure that all of your requirements are being tested and captured in your implementation. All right, folks, that's it for today. Hopefully you got something out of this video. If you found some value out of it, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, you know what to do. and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.